So I'm Deanne. Yes, some of you may remember me, some of you may not. I recognize some faces. Um, I've put my title as a cultural learning and engagement consultant, but I don't really know what that means. It just means that I've been working in museums a very, very long time. So I've done various things throughout my kind of cultural and heritage career. I've been an explainer on the gallery floor. I've been an outreach deliverer and developer and manager as well. And so I've worked with a full range of different audiences in lots of different ways, not only delivering information or communicating, whether it be science or whether it be social history, also as working in partnerships and building partnerships with community groups, with schools, and with other organizations and charities. So I'm hoping I can bring a little bit of what I've found out, the ways that the lessons learned from the mistakes I've made as well. So this continue the theme of being a listening and a learning experience today. And I've actually now moved out of the field of museums and I'm in higher education. So I'm actually working now as a community engagement officer at King's. So this is hopefully what I'll be able to also bring is a bit of a different perspective of what I'm learning from being in a different sector, but doing similar principled work and holding true to some of those same values and principles that I've developed and I've shared and learned from other people as well, going along, working in partnerships and in collaboration to build more inclusive museums, organizations, but also specifically programs that we'll be looking at today. I hope that all makes sense, and hopefully I'll learn from you as well, because we are always all learning, and I hope that I'll be inspired as much by you and what you're doing as much as I might help to raise some questions with you. So good morning, everyone. Okay, so if we move forward to the next one, to the agenda, next one. Okay, so the agenda for today, very quickly, we are going to be looking in this next section about what does inclusive programming look like. Then we'll start to think about, when we've explored some examples for that, we're going to look at how the first steps are thinking about the foundation of how we create more inclusive programs and events. Then, so those two sections will have a few exercises in them. Then we'll have a social break, I've said, just so that you can have the opportunity to either go stretch your legs, have a cup of tea, but also if you want to chat to anyone and putting any questions in. Then we're going to have some case studies from some of the museums that you know, and then we will wrap up with any questions and homework for next week. So hopefully we should be able to get through all of that, and hopefully by the end of it, we'll have some actions that we need to take away with us and start to think about and potentially help to grow a more inclusive programming approach. Okay, next. Oh yeah, just giving it away. So the aims, you're going to look at different program formats and see how they can be used to facilitate inclusion and foster that culture of diversity. And you work out and kind of understand the steps, the key steps of that development that we've built those programs with, and how to engage our public, our stakeholders and our partners during that programming process as well. So even the development process itself is inclusive, as well as the output that you create and generate. So our first thing, moving on to the next, whizzing through this, the next slide is this stage, which is what does it look like to have an inclusive programming? So thinking about like what we've got, the statement underneath says that inclusive programming is part of an organizational culture, which is we're looking at all the different parts of the organization to make an inclusive museum. And without embedding the values and principles of inclusion, the program can end up seeing as a sticky plaster approach and tokenistic. So it's really important that we think of our program as the manifestation of our inclusive practice. Okay, it's how we interact with our audiences, making it instead from them and us to we. And if we can change our mindset to think of it as a we and having a more balanced share of power, then those values and those principles will be seen in the programming that you do. So you don't even have to think about it as separately. How do I make this particular programming inclusive? Actually, everything you're doing should be inclusive, because this is just how you see it happening and coming out and being an expression of those values and principles. And it's not a gift, it is where we're making space. We're making space to share that power. So because at the moment, as museum staff and our processes, we hold most of the control about what happens in that space, it falls to us to make those changes to shift that balance. So I wanted to look at a couple of questions that I want to pose to you first of all, so we can get our minds in the right place and also understand what we mean by some of these words. So next slide. So I wanted to find out from you, first of all, what does inclusive mean to you? Now, I don't mean inclusion, that's a whole thing, and I know you've spoken about that already in previous workshops, but inclusive, what's that feel like? What does that mean? So warmth and welcoming is coming out, absolutely, like they belong, part of something connected. Everyone is able to participate, brilliant. I love this idea of comfort and warmth. Easy, oh yes, no struggle to be accepted, safe. Yes, very important, representation, absolutely. So yeah, so the words that are coming out from people are, it's that sense of belonging and feeling welcome and safe, and feeling part of something, connected. Empowerment, yes, and representation. So all those things are obviously, they are key to feeling included in a space and included in an activity. With that in mind, that's what, if you were going to go to something and it made you feel those things, what do you think you would need to make your programs inclusive? Would anyone, if you can keep going if you finish, but does anyone mind sharing some of those things that they thought they'd want to make sure they had in place if they were going to make their programs inclusive? Yeah, and I think that's something to also pick up at that, very important about dialogue and make sure there is two-way in there, so the conversation. Anyone else want to share anything to add to that? Excellent, yeah. So it's thinking about all those, as both you and Anna were saying, that range of ways in which it's accessible and all the different little things. It's the smallest things can make a difference. So it is like, what's that little thing that could just make someone feel comfortable because they don't have to search it out. It's easy to feel that you can be there. So any more? Yes, absolutely. And that's a big thing, but not in a big that it's difficult, but as in a big thing of like, if that's key there, so many other things will stem from that. And it's coupling those kind of fundamental things with all of those small actions that help to make it really a part of the fabric of your building, as well as how you act. So really good, thank you. And I'm sure there's more, but this is to add to your list as well of things, actions that you can go away and think about doing as you build your programs. Okay, so that's just to kind of start us thinking. That's just to start us thinking. And I was just going to throw in for like, just for opposites, thinking about exclusive practices and things that can also trip us up. So while we're doing all those amazing things and trying to make our, our programs and our buildings feel very welcome and that interaction really authentic, there are things we can do that can kind of counteract that as well. So we have to think about our pricing, thinking, is the pricing going to be prohibitive do we have it, do we make sure that there is concessions, and if there are concessions, how do we make those concessions accessible? And I mean literally being able to access them without it feeling like you're jumping through hoops, or that you're, we'll come to that in a second. Also thinking about the rules of engagement. Whose terms are they on? Are those terms of engagement and behaviors you're expecting in your building or in your program and your event set by you, or set by, you know, thinking about the diversity of how people might interact with you? The gatekeeping and pricing comes back into this. The gatekeeping of knowledge and culture of others as well. So if you're holding something, do you think it's something that you should be, there is that mindset that it already doesn't belong to you. It's not, you're looking after it rather than that you're a caretaker rather than a gatekeeper, and switching, because they can sometimes slip into each other, or flip from being that kind of caring sense to the controlling sense. So always asking yourself that question. And things like pricing, you know, you could price the very people who would really appreciate coming in to see that by pricing them out of that event or that exhibition. And the idea that like no one owns culture or heritage. It's created by all of us and it belongs to all of us, but none of us own it. It's a very weird paradoxical thing, but that's why it's so tricky, because we want to hold on to this thing and make sure it stays alive, but actually it's not something that it's not owned by us, but it does belong to us. So it's just to have a think about those things. What were some of the common themes that are coming out of values?
Deanne, I've taken notes for our group. Would you like me to feedback on them?
Yeah, just if there's any kind of key points.
The key sort of value is that it needs to work for the audiences and not just for the organisation. So it's not just a tick box exercise to make you feel warm and fuzzy inside. It actually genuinely has value for all audiences. Accessible displays. Everything they put out is pitched at a reading age of the average reading age, which is actually quite low. It's 9 to 10. But actually that means that if English isn't your first language, and children as well, they can understand. So that was sort of a good principle. A key point actually was reimbursements for time and energy for the groups you're working with, not just a cup of tea. I think in museums we're quite used to doing stuff with a bit of tea and cake all the time, but actually if you're in a commercial sector and if you're going to help out in a focus group, you would actually get paid a sort of a nominal fee for that time, and sort of to use those principles. So you're not just using people, you are valuing their time and commitment and energy, and being transparent in what your barriers are as an organisation, and be completely open about what you're doing and why you're doing. I think it just opens up those communication channels. Have long-lasting relationships. So you're not just looking at building a relationship with a particular community for one time or one project, that you're looking at actually this is going to be these people are in our local area. We're looking to serve this population. So it's a long time thing and not just project based. Engagement styles vary your learning styles, so that it reaches everybody. It doesn't turn people off, and keep it fresh. And the final one we talked about, and there was a lot more on the jam board, but we've only got limited time, is well-being. So that was a value that sort of those health and social well-being things need to be sort of embedded across everything that they do, and that's for them. That's a key value and principle too.
Well, from our group, did anyone? I mean, there's a couple of things that we talked about, almost questions that came up, which were really interesting. We had things definitely around being, you know, compassionate, friendly, two-way conversations and communication in our values, being very welcoming and being comfortable space for all. But we had questions around being non-judgmental. How do you be non-judgmental when everyone comes with their own biases? And it was a good point about being aware of what we bring with us, and how do we flip that to being to finding opportunities to find out about others. as well, and being playful and having a safe enough space to be playful, and how that you have to, the kind of the work that you have to do before that in order for it to be a place where you can play, and what you interpret as that. And the principles, we had things around inviting audience feedback, contesting and trialing and building in feedback, creating dialogue with audiences, going to the people, not waiting for people and expecting them to come to you, or feeling able to come to you, and making sure there's clear information about what visitors can expect, focusing on the taking part over the results, over end results as well, which I think is very important as a principle of thinking about what you're doing. It's just, I think, making sure that you have those things clear in your mind. And so even if you go back now and think, okay, what are my values and principles for the programs? What is happening in the organization? But also, what does that mean for me and the work that I'm doing? Because sometimes they may match, they should match if we're doing this across the piece. But it's also making sure, how does that translate into the principles for those different pieces of work they're doing? Because those principles might change depending on what you're looking at, but those values should stay the same, but they just help to form those principles. I hope that makes sense, and I hope that's useful, just thinking about building that foundation for the development of your programs. Okay, so let's move on to thinking about creating, thank you, Elizabeth, inclusive programs. When we're creating our inclusive programs, and I think someone said this already, it is about us, nothing about us without us, which I think is it's a snappy, but it's a very useful phrase to have in your mind. So this actually, that thought process and that phrase comes from inclusive design. Has anyone heard of inclusive design before? Some of you might have done. So inclusive design, it focuses on exploring ways of serving a full spectrum of people who make up a diverse market. This gives you a clue to where it stems from, word market. This may involve different solutions or processes for different groups of people, rather than a one-fits-all approach. So this actually originated and designed for digital services and products and environments. So it's usually, they talk about in architecture, and building buildings and making sure them accessible and inclusive. But I thought we could borrow some of those elements of inclusive design to help us think about our process. So if we go to the next slide, thank you, Elizabeth, I'm glad that's working, thank you. Inclusive design, it places people at the heart of the design process. And you might look at this later on, actually, this might come up again in future workshops when you're looking at the building itself. But here it's the fact that it does place people at the heart of the design process, and it offers a choice. So more choices, rather than where a single design solution can't accommodate all users, which the opposite, is universal design, which you might have heard of. So universal design was used a lot, and it still is quite prominent. Inclusive design is this kind of thinking, actually, sometimes the universal design still excludes those who aren't in the majority or aren't being seen or have specific needs. So we need to come down to the individual sometimes. So there are 3 dimensions of this, which are really what I think are useful to us, because 1 and 2 basically equal 3. It's nice maths. So the first one being recognizing diversity and uniqueness. So in this case, we actually want to know about the differences and recognize them and appreciate them and design for them, rather than to kind of try and level them out. So this can include, thinking about the diversity, as we said, very broadly, age, language, ability, gender, cultural background, like all of those protected characteristics, and thinking how the needs of all the customers and visitors and our partners can be met by having adaptive tools. So this is like the fact that if you have, instead of thinking as one block thing, if you have something that's flexible and what's adaptable, then you can have diversity supportive design. So things that can flex around people and their individual needs, rather than being, okay, you have to fit into the tool fits around the person. The second one, having those inclusive processes and using those tools. So that's thinking, bringing a diversity of idea and perspectives. So things that we've talked about, I mean, this is completely what we do. You know, we're trying to make sure that we involve a diversity of individuals in the team that's designing, that's being consulted or being collaborated with. And so that when it comes out, you've got a diversity of people who can engage in the end product and the end output, because of the process already involving so many different people. And then finally, by doing those two things, you get a broader beneficial impact. It's going to have more meaning because we've done the work to make it relate and resonate with more people, by talking to them and by working with them. So it means that you've got a greater, I hate to say it, but market. If you're looking for a business case, this means that you've got more people you appear to. One thing we did raise in our group was the fact that lots of these things are made more difficult by being online, by the situation, by the fact that we're going to be restricted in the traditional ways in which we engage with people. So this does come from, you know, from the digital world. So this is something that maybe we can think of, that it is possible, even with our changing circumstances. How do we adapt and stay flexible to the situation we're in, as well as to the diversity of the people that we're trying to reach? So it is about that adaptability and that flexibility in the tools we're using that will help us overcome, I think, some of those online issues. We're all getting used to it, as you can tell. So I appreciate that. So how does that relate to what we're doing? So for us, when we're thinking about our processes, if we go to the next slide, these are some of the questions, as we have that in our kind of our toolbox of that, some of those ideas about inclusive design. These are some of the questions that we need to start asking ourselves to build the structure for our programming, to create our programming. So 4 very simple questions: why, what, who, and how. And if you go through this as you're thinking, hopefully the answers that you get from these questions will give you the tools and the knowledge to develop program formats which are really the most appropriate and will get the best engagement with the widest impact. At least it will start. And I think if you look at our examples and think about how they might have applied that, you might be able to see how they've worked through those processes and come out with what they've done. So the first one is why. Why do you want to use, why are you using inclusive principles to develop your programs? And I know it's like, well, we're here and we want to do this, but actually we need to sometimes dig deeper, apart from the kind of top level things that we've said. So in those first questions, when we were looking at our values, sometimes we need to dig down. What do those big words mean? Welcoming, respect. Why are we doing that? What will it eventually lead to? Okay, so first of all, I just wanted you to write down, might not be 5 minutes, maybe 3 minutes, why you or your program activity needs to be or wants to be inclusive. Okay, so is that sentence, just a little question, is that sentence quite broad? Is it quite big? Is it a big ambitious one? It's like, I want to change the world, something like that. Brilliant, fine, not a problem. But obviously what's really helpful to make sure you can reach that is to dig deeper and to get specific. So a little exercise, which I think that it's helped to me in the past, is what I call why and because. And you might say, why is it important? You might clarify that a little bit and qualify it. Why is it needed? What's it do? What do you mean? What's it doing? And you'll say, because this. And so I want you to repeat that 5 times with why, and you saying, because this, why, because this. And I want to see where you go, because I want you to really try and investigate, what is it? And it might end up going in a circle, sometimes it does, but challenge yourself to try and think, what is underneath that? And see where it goes to. And then when you have your last 5, then just keep that and swap over. Keep that last because, and swap over. And if there is time, I don't think there will be. I think five is probably all you'll get through. But it might just get you started to think about how to dig into what you want to do and why. The big vision is great, but actually if you're going to do the work of making an inclusive program, you need to get a bit deeper. So what are our desired outcomes? You know, what are the building blocks of your that you did? What's the kind of the building blocks that help to do those things? And then the who is the audiences that you looked at last week. So you might have those missing audiences, or those people that the target audiences you wanted to connect with. When I say things around the what, as I said, it's like, what are your outcomes? What are you hoping to be, that the result of it will be that this will happen? People will be in your gallery, people will be adding to the stories, blah, 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 and who it is. And then we can think about, how do we get there? What do we need to get to those places with the how? Let's look at the how. I think the how is really important because there's some really key questions there. Is there one that's a burning question that how has been bothering them in a long while that you want to raise now? This is your time.
I'm going to cut in here because actually we have a whole session on workforce in a few weeks. So it might be better to, if it's okay, Deanne, to pop and to ask Tan, who'll be running a whole session on workforce and hopefully be tackling that.
What I would say is, if you're looking, there are different things to say there, which will be covered in the next session. But have a think about whether are you able to, what jobs are you thinking about here? Are we talking about volunteer jobs? Are we talking about internships? Are we talking about paid positions? All of that, because there'll be slightly different tools to use depending on where you can, you know, when you're looking at workforce diversity, what can you make a difference in? What's realistic? Are you going to be offering paid jobs, or are we looking at the volunteer profile here? So just have a think of that over the coming weeks.
So I'm going to talk today about the autism-friendly programming that we've done at the Museum of the Order of St. John, where I work. Just to give you a little bit of context for those of you who are unfamiliar with us, our museum tells the story, as the name suggests, of the Order of St. John, which is a modern-day order of chivalry. But also the parent charity of St. John Ambulance, which you're probably more familiar with, the first aid charity. Our story goes back almost 900 years to a hospital which was established in Jerusalem in the 11th century. So our collection of objects is vast and includes everything from medieval armour to 20th century first aid equipment. And we also have an extensive archive and library. And there's a little YouTube video there which you can watch in your own time if you'd like to have a bit more of an idea of what we're about. So we're located in Clerkenwell, just outside the city. And the museum is housed in this Tudor gatehouse, which was once the entrance to the Priory of the Order. We have the fun of a split site, so the main museum is in this gatehouse, but across the road we also have a church with also another little gallery, a garden and a learning centre. So to come round to autism, I was trying to remember as I put this presentation together how we kind of came to this project, and I think it came out of Hannah, who is the Learning and Access Officer that Emily is maternity cover for. She went to a Kids in Museums training session about autism in museums, and I think just realised that this was an audience that we had a potential to be, to sort of quite easily do some very good things for, basically, because we're a kind of fairly small, quiet museum that we could sort of really sort of make the most of that asset. And then she saw an opportunity to apply for a London Museum Development Diversity Matters programme grant to make it happen, which I will come on to. So probably everybody already has an idea about what autism is, and I'm not going to go too much into it now, but just to give you an idea, this is the National Autistic Society definition. I think there are lots of definitions out there, but there are perhaps kind of two essential elements. One is to do with difficulties around social interaction and communication, and then another is to do with difficulties with sensory processing, leading to people perhaps experiencing sensory overload or seeking greater sensory stimulation. So, as I said, we applied for a London Museum Development Diversity Matters programme grant. So we liaised with Deanne, so it's very nice to put a face to a name today, and later with Rachel as well. So I think it was up to £1,000 that we could apply for, and we applied for 800, but in the end we only spent 600. And our main costs were autism awareness staff training, paying for that was nearly £200, and then a storyteller that we had for our kind of trial family-friendly autism session, or autism-friendly family session rather, which I'll talk a bit more about. And then we spent the rest of the money really on kind of resources. So really the idea of applying for the grant was that it would really allow us to kind of set things up, so that this wasn't just a short-term project. This was something that we could kind of set up and really embed in our programme and keep doing in the long term. So we bought sort of these fidgets and communication cards and lots of ear defenders, both adult ones and child ones, bean bags. So yeah, money well spent. So the kind of first thing we had was autism awareness training for staff and to kind of set things up. So we had Gillam run the training for us, and she was fab. We kind of chose her because she specialises in autism and also specialises in kind of museum and heritage. So she could really tailor her training to the kind of thing that we needed. And we included everyone we possibly could in the training, so all our staff right up to the museum director, the curator. We included staff from other parts of our directorate, because sometimes our volunteers who largely work back of house work with staff in other parts of the directorate. So to also make us sort of welcoming to volunteers who might potentially be autistic. We would like to have included our security guards because they often interact with the public, but it sort of became financially prohibitive because we would have had to pay each of them for a 12-hour shift, so it would have been a very big cost to do that. But I would say if you could, that would be a great thing to do. We didn't do the training for volunteers because our volunteers don't work in public-facing roles, but I know lots of places do include volunteers who work in public-facing roles with training like this. We also had staff from another couple of local museums, so we had staff from Charterhouse and from Islington Museum come and join us. So we spread the joy. So the kind of main output of the funding was this session that we ran in February half term, an autism-friendly family activity, which was acted not just as a kind of a day out, but also as a consultation session for us to kind of try things out and consult with the target audience, if you like, in order to really get their views on how to programme in the future. So we advertised via our website, Facebook, Twitter. We also have a contact at Holborn Community Association who put out the word for us. I think Twitter was particularly successful because it's very easy. We tagged lots of relevant people, as you can see there, and I think it's quite easy to target particular groups on Twitter that way. I know she's been mentioned before, Claire Madge of Autism in Museums. She has a listings section on her website or blog. So I'm not sure if we got in there or not, but I definitely recommend getting in there. We made spaces for 10 children plus accompanying adults available to book via Eventbrite, free booking. And all 10 spots were reserved within 24 hours. So that really showed us that there was great demand for this sort of programming. So that was very exciting. So I should say as well, it's 10 children, and it could be autistic children and their siblings, and then obviously accompanying adults. So we made a visual story to send out to families who have booked in advance to let them know what to expect. So this is one slide from that visual story, but I'll send it to Elizabeth afterwards so she can circulate it. So visual stories, for those of you who aren't familiar, are to let people know exactly what to expect, particularly from a kind of social point of view and a sensory point of view. So you might include how to get to the venue, what the spaces look like, who they might meet, what they can expect happening when, where might be busy or noisy or particularly light, bright, or a bit dark, even where there might be particular smells, and all this kind of thing. So I'm trying to focus today on programming because I know that's kind of the theme of the day, but we also made visual stories about visiting our museum galleries just as a drop-in visitor, and going on a guided tour, and those are on our website if you want to have a peek. And we've got hard copies available as well, and that's quite a nice, very easy and free way to make your museum more accessible to autistic people or just anyone who wants to have a good idea of what to expect. I'm aware that I've already nearly reached 10 minutes, so I'm going to try and speed up. So I'd really recommend this resource Kids in Museums have on their website about autism in museums, which is written in collaboration with Claire Madge from Autism in Museums. And they have loads of links to good examples if you want ideas for visual stories. And these are some visual stories that I looked at in coming up with ours. So take a look at those. So we have this split site, and in some ways this is an advantage for this session because it meant we could kind of keep one site exclusively for the autism-friendly family session. So we actually closed it off to the public. The main museum was still open, but the garden, one little gallery, and the learning centre were all just exclusively for people attending this session. So that was really nice, and it meant that we could run it in the middle of the day at a kind of normal time, as it were, rather than having it as an early bird session. And we put up signs all over the museum.
Rachel,
and around.
I'm going to have to stop you.
Okay.
Because we have a few other case studies.
So quick introduction, my name's Rebecca and I'm the museum manager of Hackney Museum. For those that don't know us, we're a small local authority run museum in North East London, in a rapidly changing and diverse multicultural area. About a third of our community identifies as being of African or African Caribbean descent. And we've got quite a strong reputation for engaging local communities in every strand of the museum's work. I'm going to focus today on co-curation, but that doesn't include all the wider work within our programming and our amazing learning team. So I just want to touch upon what we mean by co-curation, because I personally feel it's rapidly becoming a bit of a buzzword. A lot of people make references to it in papers and don't really describe their methodologies or what they mean, and then the following verbs they use are quite telling that they're really looking at sort of wider engagement or feedback. So the way Hackney Museum sees it is it's opening up key decision-making processes to members of the community, really enabling people to become partners in decision-making. And as curators, sort of increasingly becoming like facilitators rather than sort of the one that's fully in control of the situation. And this is part of a wider process of the museum going through organisational change to sort of put community decision making at the heart of what we do. And the exhibitions programme is really central to helping communities feel ownership of the museum. And I've been asked today to talk a bit in particular about our African and Caribbean communities, but I would like to stress everything I'm going to touch upon here sort of goes into any community it could work with, I'd say. So because we've just got 10 minutes, I'm going to talk about a few of our favorite tools that we use that, to be honest, I think anybody could start to use. They're not cost prohibitive and they're quite simple ways to get started. And one of them is a community forum. And simply put, a community forum is getting a whole bunch of people together in one room. For us, realistically, that's about between 20 and 40, with some kind of investment in the topic at the very start of your project. Essentially, it's an open event. It's taking place ideally about a year or 2 years in advance of your project, where people can come together to share their ideas, opinions, stories, and what they want to see included. Some tips for how to get the most out of your community forum. First, I think it's to get out your collections of stories you already know about, as an example here with a project we did about women's history. It helps give people something to respond to, but it also helps establish trust that your organisation is engaged in the topic, and you might have been doing work in this area for years with your collections, and it's not just tokenistic that you're doing now. Like the people attending your event, you also are very invested and care about the topic. And I think this is important when you're working with a community who might not have a relationship with you already. Moving on from exhibitions, recently we've been involved in a project to help review, rename and reclaim public spaces in the borough that have been named after individuals who are attached to the slave trade. And we've been using the same community forum in a digital form, so we did it on Zoom. And it was a great relief to see that this worked as well. And in that context, to establish trust, we actually reviewed the work of what the council have been doing over the last 6 months to get that sense of trust to go, we do believe in this and we are doing all this work behind the scenes. And I think that's really important to get people to engage. The second main tip I do is to encourage conversations, because people don't just turn up and like to talk in a vacuum. You need to get the conversation flowing and encourage people. Is if you can get some friends, people who are outside your organisation with a connection or some sort of stake in the subject being discussed, to talk on your behalf. Partly this is because they're a lot more interesting than we are as museum staff, but they can sort of talk from a personal perspective of why they are personally getting involved in your museum project, why they think the subject is important, and in some ways kind of vouch for your organisation on your behalf, which I think is really important when you're working with a particular community who, again, might not have an existing relationship with your organisation. And so I would strongly recommend, who is it that you know of your organisation who can potentially speak on your behalf and encourage others to get involved and open up with their conversations. And then we break out into smaller groups, or now we've moved to digital, we use out the breakout room functions in Zoom. So this is where, because when you've got about 40 people, you're only going to have a few loud voices that are confident to speak in those situations. So we get everybody to smaller groups and then have icebreaker brainstorming activities amongst the participants. And this becomes a really valuable resource of local knowledge. And it can identify a lot of people or stories that you might want to feature in the end of your output, whether that's an exhibition or a program. It also helps to get a really clear steer what everybody is thinking about, what they want in terms of the scope of your project, or what they want the messaging to be, or the emotional experience of being involved. And these have just been amazing, fantastic crowdsourcing events, and you often see the outputs from these forums in the end exhibitions. A practical tip, I would recommend to have a facilitator on each table to make sure that sort of things stay on time, but also to make sure notes are kept so you have a reference. And the nice thing about these forum events is when they go well, you can be walking around and you can hear laughter, you can hear discussion, or even sometimes friendly, heated debate, all amongst strangers who've never met each other before, but have a shared interest in the topic that you're trying to discuss. And just another example of one of our panels, you can see I'm a big fan of spider diagrams as a useful, quick way to capture a lot of information. So it might be, what stories do you want to see, or what does the exhibition need to do and feel like? And then this helps you bring together all your notes. as we recently moved towards digital, we've started using Jamboards, which are a very useful way. You essentially digitally put post-it notes on a page. So if nobody's used that before, I strongly recommend. I think it's a free Google software, Jamboards. They're quite visually appealing, and they have the same sort of functionality as a spider diagram that we don't necessarily have now with pen and paper. And then, yeah, so these are some examples. This is a shot of one of the spider diagrams that came out of our project that we did last year going into this year about African and Caribbean hair and style. And it was really nice to see what came up on each table and group and the strong themes that came about. And so really, just from one evening's work, we get a really strong brief about what people want to see about the project, but it also gets them really excited about being involved. The second tool I'd like to quickly talk about is our advisory panels or steering groups. So beyond the one-off event, we recruit a small group of between 8 and 10 individuals who are going to meet on a regular basis to help make sure that we are meeting the requirements of what the community needs that exhibition to do. And the important thing about this is it sort of gives us accountability to make sure that we're meeting so not only are we allowing people to make the key decisions central to a project, but people can check up on how we're doing and make sure that the museum is meeting those requirements. We recruit people on the basis to represent and access target audience, or draw upon friends and key stakeholders in the organisation being represented. But we do encourage them to sort of invite and recommend outsiders. And they tend to meet monthly or bi-monthly if we've got a longer project and that's a better fit. And so here's an example of something very similar to a steering group with a exhibition not targeted at the African and Caribbean community, but working with vulnerable young mums. And as you can say, they can be quite a casual feel. For these ones, we often had children walking up and down the table or clambering onto various people's laps. One of the really useful things you can get from an advisory panel is a mission statement, which is it's a really good thing to do right at the start of your project, where you get you summarize what you're hearing from your members into a draft statement, and that they can debate and rewrite as a group. And then we tend to review or display this mission statement at the start of each session. So essentially what they're doing is giving museum staff a brief by which to develop the exhibition content. And again, it's something that we know if we've succeeded or failed because we've got a standard judge against us, judge the project against. Useful things to help feedback to your advisory panel is exhibition walkthroughs. Because as creators, we recognise that we're telling stories in a wider narrative, and it's hard to get a sense of that without the physical exhibition to share. So one way we've started to do this is by basic PowerPoint presentations, and they can get a sense of what history, what stories are going on, and understand what the exhibition is like. And if you've got more fancy resources, you can also show them the physical design of the exhibition, as we've got this example here. And so this way of working feeds into our Black History Month exhibitions we do each year. I already mentioned the Hackney Scott Style exhibition. And the one thing I'd like to sort of touch upon as well is we do, as well as our collections, use a lot of loans from local individuals. And this is such a big way of making people feel ownership of the end project, to see themselves represented. But also, I think, especially if you work in a local context, visitors to the museum recognise some of the people that feature in the exhibition. And that sort of really helps them feel included and involved and makes it very real for them. And so I would recommend using personal loans quite a bit. And I've got some overall learnings from our sort of things that the museum's learned over the years about co-curation. However, I think if Elizabeth, I'm on time. Okay, brilliant.
Okay, so yes, I'm Deborah Hedgecock, and I'm the curator at Bruce Castle Museum in Haringey, neighbouring Hackney, and very similar profiles in our borough makeup of different communities. But today I've been asked to look at working with LGBTQI+ groups and organisations, and our journey to what you can see on the screen here of the project Haringey Vanguard. there we have Bruce Castle Museum in Tottenham. So it's a massive 16th century manor house, and we're the home to the whole of Haringey's collections and archives for the borough. And working with communities is the way that we work, and Rebecca so eloquently and showed the different ways that we also work with our communities. But for us, with the LGBTQI plus communities, it's been a challenge to try and get to the current project that we have today. So I was going to just share a bit of that journey. We have from the building there, you wouldn't realise that in the 17th century there was a gay butler there, and how do you present that history where all you know is the reference to somebody who was not put to death, but certainly shown in records to have been put to trial for his acts of homosexuality at the time. So Haringey is very, for many people, I hope, is known as a key council, if not the council, that was central to a lot of the fighting and advocating for lesbian and gay rights in the 1980s, and with a focus in particular on Clause 28. So here we have a range of different images of what I've tried to cram in to show today, but so we have a lot of references, we have official records and about that particular history and charting that particular history. But when I came to the museum, despite all best efforts in the past to collect, the difficulty was having those community voices, those personal stories that could complement and support and reflect those official histories that was certainly the rhetoric of the 1980s. And so it was helpful to have the platforms of LGBT Month, and certainly the libraries in Haringey, as many other boroughs in London, have always been involved in showcasing LGBT histories during LGBT History Month, and certainly Bruce Castle has been part of that. But that's surprisingly a relatively recent introduction to have such a month. But it's not just having a month, it's about how do you embrace those histories. And I suppose the difficulty for us is how do you access groups and organisations and networks that may, for the very reason of their may themselves be very much hidden. So one very good helpful move for us was to get involved with what was then called equalities in the council, and so there were very good equality officers at the time, and in 2009, so over a decade ago, we worked with trying to access networks and groups and organisations through our equalities department. And so we thought that we would invite people to a very simple approach to engagement, but to invite people to share their collections with us for an exhibition. So we were able to then, through particular existing networks, get people who were activists, councillors, former councillors, people who were involved in cultural activities to actually contribute to this exhibition. So it was people, to be perfectly honest, they were people who were very busy, but they found the time to find the key thing that represented them. And here we have the woman in the right hand corner, Boone Temple, who gave the t-shirt. She was the woman that some of you may know who sat on Nicholas Witchell in the BBC News evening programme as they stormed the BBC studios. So, but the problem with asking people to bring in their collections is that they took them all away again. So although it raised awareness of the stories that we wanted to reflect more within our collections, it was the difficulty of how do we add objects and other parts of collections, and other histories, artifacts, etc., to our collections. So there were opportunities at that time to collect all the histories, but so it was a bit of a flash in the pan and disappointing, because obviously things like that T-shirt, maybe Boone eventually might add them to our collections, who knows, but it was very much coming on loan and people recognizing key national stories in the locality, but they also went out the door as well. So I'm just checking the time. So from 2009, it was we didn't really, despite all I've said about having a very positive council, it wasn't, I wouldn't say, embraced throughout the council. And although the libraries do reflect LGBT history, it was quite hard to maintain the profile and the focus. So we felt that we needed to do more. So we worked with, took the opportunity for the London Museums Group with, there was an opportunity to do to work with people at UCL. So we then curated the Molly Spoon archive, where we Molly houses in the 17th century, and it's about using spoons, wooden spoons, to collect stories, to make your own Molly spoon. Molly houses had men who had pretend marriages, and they had babies in the form of wooden spoons. They used to dress them up like dolls. But this was what do you do when you lose that hidden history? So but again, this was an opportunity to get people to engage through doing workshops and working with LGBT heritage specialists. And we have Tim Redfern here, who some of you may have come across, but he's someone who's been Molly spooning across the country, I think, and certainly around London, creating Molly spoons. So this was an opportunity to really invite people to engage, and that was very difficult nonetheless, although it was very open, and we had them in a museum where lots of different families were coming along, and we had drag queens in the museum making these Molly spoons. So it was rather, for some people, quite a nervous thing to take part in. But we managed to create different stories and make these spoons and add them to the collections. And in the corner, we actually had Sadie Lee, who works with at the National Gallery for Queer Perspectives. She happens to be a local artist as well, so I'm praising her with local artists, but she was fantastic, and she created this beautiful portrait of herself in drag. But that was the clear journey that we had to partake in to add to our stories, and of co-curating and co-collecting and the associated events, to try and engage a lot more people and to establish more of a visibility in the museum, to showcase these particular histories from the very important national and specialist types of collections that we do have, but to have everyday people's voices. We've had other exhibitions of different artists since, but we've ended up working with under Metropolitan Archives, and this has been an opportunity to really embrace the networking opportunities. So and I think it's much easier process now than it was 10 years ago to start this journey, but this has been an opportunity where Haringey Vanguard has looked at working with BAME, LGBTQ plus communities and individuals in the borough and people who have moved away from the borough to collect, but also to have different types of events at Bruce Castle, and to establish regular meetings at the museum so that people can come along and share their stories, not in a formal way which gets added to the collections, but just to meet and share stories and reflect and or plan, and to have a very relaxed space where they feel that they are part of the building, and to look at what we have done in the past to get to that journey. So this is a Heritage Lottery funded or National Lottery Heritage funded project that has now gone into its third year.
Thank you so much, Deborah, and to Rebecca and to Rachel. We have 5 minutes, and it's a very quick 5 minutes. So if anybody has any questions they would like to ask the panel, then please go ahead.
Ultimately, how we advertise a lot of things via our newsletter, social media, press releases, and what really works for us is if it's for the African and Caribbean community in particular. If we're looking into the exhibition for next year's Black History Season, we'll advertise it as part of the Black History Season programme the previous year, so it gets advertised in all the sorts of events. And sometimes there is confusion by what the event is, and people think they're going to turn up to a talk about a subject and they're suddenly faced with this forum. And one of the nice things is a lot of people that didn't know what the event was do stay and take part and get really engaged, which I think is lovely because it means we're reaching people that don't usually get involved with creating exhibitions. I should say that Hackney Museum's been working in this sort of collaborative way for quite a long time, and so it does impact the audiences that follow us, but also people that have a relationship over the years with museums. So sometimes we do get people that come to several forums like this, particularly because people don't belong to one static community. So for example, in some of those photos there was some young people in there that had featured in a project about adults with learning disability, but when we said, oh, we're doing something about African and Caribbean music, they were interested and they came to that as well. So I think you'd be surprised sometimes if you just spread the message wide and far. If the topic's right, if it's something that people are interested in, they'll come.
Does anyone else have any questions for any of the fabulous panel members?
I was just going to say that I was going to mention the Norfolk LGBT network that showcases a lot of work with young people, and also the LGBTQ conference at LMA each year, and that's a really good opportunity for showcasing projects and collections and networking with different people, and a lot of heritage people, workers in the heritage sector do go along, but it's an opportunity to meet people and find out all different projects that are going on, but also different individual stories as well. So that was, I went to it last year, and it was very, very good networking opportunity to meet people and find out best practice from people who have really honed their skills in engaging with young people, organising walks, etc. So
thank you, Deborah. So if I bring Deanne back in, can you hear? If there were any final questions.
There are a few things I saw on there were 3 things I saw in the Padlet with the how, and there were some interesting things, but I think I will save that and send them, maybe I'll send them as follow-ups. Things around marketing. We talked about recruitment, you're going to do a workshop developing audience advocates and advisories, and the techniques, different techniques and ways that, as Rachel mentioned, like with community forums, there's also listening campaigns, and thinking about that consultation in the planning stage as well as the kind of collections. So I'll have a think, and maybe I can see if I can find a few pointers as well. But I just wanted to round up by saying thank you. First of all, thank you very much for everyone taking part, and I hope you've got something from it and you got some techniques or valuable information, or even finding out from each other. But the key things that I found, just as the big things kind of to remember to do, to reach out and get out into your communities. As a lot of you said, don't wait for them to come to you, but actually get out there and make friends, find out who your neighbours are, ask questions. If you don't know, ask the questions and listen, making sure that it's an active listening and that you're being able to think about how you then go on to respond and collaborate with those people who have given you that, as you say, their time is precious. How you collaborate with them to come up with someone and evaluate at every stage. At the beginning, those questions, evaluations, like I asked you at the beginning of this session, how you were feeling, what your thoughts were on this session, evaluating during the process so you have action research going on, and then evaluating at the end to find out whether you've succeeded in what you hoped, or finding out what has come out of it, even if you weren't quite sure what was going to be the result. Evaluating to find out what has happened, as well as if you have succeeded in your achieving your values and keeping strong to your principles, and doing it all over again. So just having those major marks of thinking, are you making sure those are in your processes? Are they key parts, as well as everything else you'll be thinking of? But I'm very excited to hear what you carry on to do in the future. And it's like, this is just the beginning. This is just a kind of foundation. The exciting work is the next thing to come. But I'm more than happy to be a helping ear or offering advice where I can.
Thank you so much, Deanne. That's been really, really valuable. And as you said, it's a start on a journey, and hopefully the case studies has helped you, give you a few ideas of how you can do that. And don't remember, we've got 3 more sessions left, and then Rachel can offer some individual support as well. So it's very much sort of a learning journey, and that we're all going on together.